My first diary was a gift from my mother when I was in fifth grade. Recently, two of my grandsons found my old diary and wanted to read what I had written. Most of it was boring. But when I read about having a crush on a boy, the grandsons became interested. My fifth grade uncertainty in how to deal with liking a member of the opposite sex started a discussion on how a boy can tell if a girl really likes them and vice versa. Though my fifth grade spelling was atrocious, reading my diary made me realize that writing out my feelings helped me process them. Writing for a highly emotional person of any age can be a good way to process emotions. That fifth grade diary started my lifelong journaling habit that eventually led me to write a newspaper column on relationships for 9 years. And then I turned some of those columns into a book called Family Fuzz, which is for sale on Amazon, by the way. I suspect that my mother gave me that fifth grade diary because she was a journal writer herself. When she passed away 3 years ago, I ended up with multiple notebooks full of her writing, much of what was just reporting what she did and who she hung with each day. Yet reading about her life in those journals pleased me because I found it reassuring that she'd had a rich and happy life for the most part. See, we lost my dad when my mother was only 46, and I had often worried that she was lonely, especially after the last of her 6 children left home. But their diary told the tales of her active involvement in community, church, friendships, and in family. I inherited my mother's writing bug because I too have filled notebooks upon notebooks with my scribbling. I came across 2 drawerfuls of my old journals recently that were written when my children were growing up. Much of it would be probably boring to anyone else, but I did find a few nuggets that I think are worth sharing. And one of them is called Slumbering Whispers. So here it is. When my children were small, every night I would sneak in their rooms to check on them. The checking was more for me than for them. I just had to make sure they were okay, breathing well, and sleeping soundly, which I think is a common practice for many mothers. And then I read a story about a girl who had recovered from a coma. The doctors had told her family to talk to her as she slept, even if she didn't seem to be hearing them or responding. When she did recover, she told her family she had heard them talking to her as she slept. After hearing her story, I decided to add another part to my nightly checks of my children's slumber. As I stopped to observe them sleeping, I would whisper, "I love you." Though they never told me in the morning they remembered hearing it, I believed that somewhere in their psychic they were hearing it. One night as I whispered, "I love you," to my son, I heard back, "I love you too, Mom." He turned and smiled at me. I hugged him. He said, "I've heard you other nights. I decided to tell you back." I continued for many years my nightly whispers, adding other comments sometimes. If one of my children were going through a particularly tough time, I would add, "You can do it. I believe in you." If they succeeded in passing a tough test, I'd whisper, "Good job. You're an outstanding student." I took pleasure in finding positive phrases that could inspire, reassure, comfort, or just tell them that I loved them. Over the years, I realized I should be saying those comments during my waking hours and their waking hours too, like at the dinner table, over the phone, or maybe just as we did chores together. Unfortunately, I was never as consistent in the waking hours in my love expressions as I whispered to them in their slumber. And then, of course, as they grew to teenagers, I would often be in bed before them. Gradually, sadly, I gave up my nightly whispering. Now I realize that I could have whispered "I love yous" in the morning when they were sleeping in late, but somehow that hectic morning routine I never thought of doing it at the time. I have also learned to whisper I love yous to my husband if he's in bed before I am, which is often the case. Sometimes if he's just going to sleep, he'll wake up as my son did and turn and whisper I love you back to me. So at the end of my Slumbering Whispers journal, I had written the following, which probably isn't totally related to this topic, but I think it's worth including. I'd written, making a living is different than making a life. Standard of living is different than quality of life. Whispering I love you to your loved ones as they sleep is a quality of life thing. You might want to try it. That's all, for goodness sake.